The prison transport cut through the darkness of space like a blade through silk. Inside the reinforced cargo hold, General Vrask sat motionless in his restraints. His crimson scales, once polished and gleaming in military parades, were now dull and scratched. The horns that had crowned his head were broken stumps, shattered during his capture. He was 8 feet of defeated rage, wrapped in chains that could hold a small cargo vessel. Detention Station Omega-7 waited ahead like a metal tomb. Vrask had destroyed 40 worlds during the Nebralis campaign. 2 billion souls had vanished under his command, turned to ash and memory. The War Crimes Tribunal had been brief. They showed him images of burning cities, of refugees fleeing through irradiated wastelands, of mass graves that stretched beyond the horizon. He had looked at each image without expression. What could he say? He remembered giving those orders. He remembered believing they were necessary. The docking clamp seized the transport with a metallic shriek. Guards in full combat armor surrounded Vrask the moment the doors opened. They kept their weapons trained on his chest, their fingers nervous on the triggers. Station Commander Hendricks stood waiting in the receiving bay, a tall woman with gray hair and eyes like chips of ice. She studied Vrask the way someone might study a dangerous animal behind glass. "General Vrask," she said, her voice flat. "You will address me as commander. You will obey every instruction immediately. You will not speak unless spoken to. Any deviation from these rules will result in punishment. Do you understand?" Vrask said nothing. What was there to understand? He was a weapon that had been disarmed, a dragon with clipped wings. The guards shoved him forward when he did not respond quickly enough. He walked through corridors of steel and hatred. Prisoners pressed against their cell barriers to watch him pass. Some spat, others screamed threats. A few simply stared with hollow eyes that had seen their worlds burn. They placed him in the maximum security wing, in a cell designed for beings of his size and strength. The walls were reinforced titanium. The door was 4 inches thick. A small window allowed guards to observe him, but he could see nothing beyond his cage. They removed his restraints and sealed him inside. The lights dimmed to a twilight gloom. Vrask sat on the metal bench that served as his bed and stared at his hands. These hands had signed execution orders. These hands had pushed pieces across tactical maps while subordinates reported casualty numbers. He had believed in strength in the doctrine of his people. The Crethean Dominion taught that mercy was weakness, that the strong survived by dominating the weak. He had been the perfect student of that philosophy. Now he was the student of nothing, trapped in a box waiting to die. Days blurred together in the monotony of prison routine. Guards delivered food through a slot in the door. Vrask did not touch it. Other inmates in his wing were survivors from the Nebralis system, people who had lost everything to his campaign. Their hatred saturated the air like radiation. During the brief exercise periods when they released him into a small yard, 3 of them attacked him despite the risk of punishment. Vrask fought back with the efficiency of a lifetime soldier. 1 attacker did not get up again. The guards had been slow to intervene. Vrask understood. They wanted him dead too. Everyone did. He accepted this as the natural order of things. He had brought death to billions. Now death waited for him, patient and inevitable. On the 6th night, Vrask noticed something different. The night shift janitor had arrived to clean the corridor outside his cell. Through the small window, Vrask could see an older human man pushing a mop bucket, his movements methodical and unhurried. The man was perhaps 50, with thinning brown hair going gray at the temples. He wore the simple gray uniform of station maintenance workers. His name tag read David Walsh. David mopped the floor outside Vrask's cell without looking up. He worked in silence, the only sound the slosh of water and the squeak of the mop against the metal floor. When he finished, he moved to the next section. But before he left, he did something strange. He reached into his lunch container and pulled out a sealed ration pack. He placed it on the floor near the food slot of Vrask's cell, then continued down the corridor without a word. Vrask stared at the ration pack for hours. It sat there in the dim light untouched. He did not understand this action. The guards had been clear that he would receive standard prison rations and nothing more. This human had no reason to give him anything. No reason to show even this small gesture. As the hours stretched toward dawn, hunger finally drove Vrask to retrieve the pack. The food was simple, the kind of portable meal that workers carried. It tasted better than anything the prison had served him. Not because the quality was superior, but because someone had chosen to give it to him. Someone had seen him as something other than a monster, even if only for a moment. The next night, David returned to clean the corridor. Again, he left a ration pack. Again, he said nothing. Vrask watched him through the window, studying this strange human who showed neither fear nor hatred, just the quiet focus of a man doing his job. On the third night, Vrask finally spoke. "Why?" David paused in his mopping. He looked up at the window where Vrask's reflection could be seen in the dim light. "Same reason I mop floors," David said, his voice rough from disuse. "Someone has to." Then he continued his work, leaving another ration pack, and disappeared into the shadows of the corridor. Vrask held the food in his hands and felt something he had not experienced in years. Confusion, because kindness had no place in his understanding of the universe, and yet here it was, offered without explanation by a janitor who had every reason to hate him. David Walsh had learned long ago that routine was the only defense against memory. Wake at 5, shower, dress in the gray maintenance uniform, eat a simple breakfast, arrive at detention station Omega 7 by 6:30 for the night shift that ran until dawn, clean the corridors, empty the waste systems, maintain the equipment that kept thousands of inmates alive in their metal cages, go home, sleep, repeat. The routine kept the ghosts at bay. Most of them anyway. Margaret still found him sometimes, usually in the quiet hours between midnight and 3. She would appear in his mind exactly as she had been, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, her eyes bright with enthusiasm as she explained her latest xenobiology research. She had believed that understanding alien species was the key to peaceful coexistence. She had believed that knowledge built bridges where weapons built only graves. She had been on Nebralis 6 when the bombardment came. A research station studying the local ecosystem, completely unarmed, clearly marked as civilian. The Dragon of Nebralis had classified it as a military target and erased it from existence. 247 scientists and support staff had died in seconds. Margaret had been 42 years old. That was 3 years ago. David had spent the first year drowning in rage, the second year drowning in alcohol, and the third year drowning in routine. The job at Omega 7 had been a lifeline. It asked nothing of him except consistency. Show up, clean, leave, do not think, do not feel, just work. Then they brought in Vrask and the routine became complicated. David had recognized the name immediately. Everyone in human space knew the Dragon of Nebralis, the alien general who had turned the Nebralis campaign into a genocide. David's first impulse had been to request a transfer to a different wing. He did not want to be near the thing that had killed Margaret. But transfers required explanations, and explanations required talking about Margaret, and talking about Margaret broke the routine. So he stayed. He cleaned the corridor outside Vrask's cell like he cleaned every other corridor. He tried not to think about who was behind that door, but on the 6th day he noticed the untouched food trays piling up. The alien was starving himself. David told himself it was not his problem. Let the monster die. The universe would be better for it. He continued his work and tried to ignore the voice in his head that sounded suspiciously like Margaret, asking him if revenge through neglect was really any different from murder. He left the first ration pack almost without thinking. It was extra food from his own lunch, something that would go to waste otherwise. Practical, efficient. Nothing to do with mercy or kindness. Just reducing waste. The ration pack was gone the next night. David left another one. And another. A pattern emerged without him consciously choosing it. When Vrask finally spoke, asking why, David had given the simplest answer he could find. Someone has to. It was the truth as far as it went. Someone had to show basic human decency, even to monsters, because the alternative was becoming a monster yourself. Margaret had taught him that, though he had not appreciated the lesson at the time. The conversations started small. Brief exchanges in the dim hours of the night shift. Vrask would ask questions about the station, about Earth, about things that seemed designed to understand humanity. David answered carefully, revealing nothing personal, maintaining the distance of a professional doing his job. But distance was hard to maintain over time. Weeks turned into months. Other guards noticed David's interactions with Vrask and made their opinions clear. Someone spray-painted Dragon Lover on his locker. His lunch went missing from the break room refrigerator. In the cafeteria, other workers moved away when he sat down. Commander Hendricks called him in for a meeting. She sat behind her desk, her expression unreadable. "I want to be clear about something, Walsh. That thing in cell 47 is a war criminal responsible for billions of deaths. He is not a person. He is not a being deserving of compassion. He is a monster in a cage. Do you understand? David had nodded. I understand what he is, Commander. Then why are you talking to it? I talk to everyone on my rounds, Commander. Inmates sometimes have maintenance issues to report. This is not about maintenance issues. Hendricks leaned forward. People are watching. Survivors are watching. They see you showing preferential treatment to Vrask and it looks bad. It looks like you sympathize with him. David met her eyes. I don't sympathize with him, Commander. I just do my job. Then do your job without the extra ration packs and the conversations. David had agreed, but he had not stopped. He could not explain why, even to himself. Maybe it was Margaret's voice in his head. Maybe it was the simple fact that everyone else wanted Vrask to suffer, and David had seen enough suffering to know it solved nothing. Maybe he was just tired of hatred. One night Vrask asked about David's past. The question came during a quiet moment when David was finishing his cleaning rounds. You were military, Vrask said. It was not a question. Your posture. Your efficiency. Your calm in the presence of violence. You served. David paused in his work. 10 years, Marines, nothing special. You saw combat, some, and after. David resumed mopping. After I got married. Had a life. Normal things. You speak in past tense. David said nothing for a long moment. The mop moved back and forth, back and forth. Finally he spoke, his voice carefully neutral. My wife died in the Nebralis campaign. Civilian research station on Nebralis 6. Wrong place, wrong time. The silence that followed was absolute. David finished his section of corridor and moved on without looking at the cell window. He did not return for 3 days, trading shifts with other workers. When he finally came back, he left the ration pack as usual but did not speak. Vrask's voice came through the darkness anyway. I did not know your face carried such weight. David stopped. What? The humans I killed. I never saw their faces. Never knew their names. They were numbers in reports, coordinates on maps. Strategic necessities. Vrask's voice was rough, as if the words were difficult to form. I did not know that each number was a face like yours carrying the weight of someone else's world. David stared at the mop in his hands. Margaret's voice whispered in his memory, talking about her research, about the importance of seeing individuals rather than categories. He wanted to rage at Vrask, to tell him that realizing this now was too late, that Margaret was still dead and his guilt changed nothing. Instead, he just picked up his bucket and walked away. But the next night he returned. And the night after that, the pattern continued unbroken, a small point of routine in a universe that made increasingly little sense. Kellen had been 17 when the bombardment destroyed his home on Nebralis through. His mother had shielded him with her body when the ceiling collapsed, and he had survived because she had not. His father had gone to search for his sister in the rubble and never returned. Kellen had dug through the remains of his neighborhood for 3 days before the rescue teams found him. He never found his father. He never found his sister. He found pieces of people he had known his entire life, scattered like broken toys across a landscape that no longer resembled home. Now he was 20, serving a 5-year sentence for assaulting a Crethean diplomat who had come to Earth on a peace mission. The court had called it a hate crime. Kellen called it unfinished business. When they told him that General Vrask would be held at Omega-7, he had felt something like joy for the first time in 3 years. The universe was giving him an opportunity. The plan came together over weeks. 3 other inmates, all survivors from different Nebralis worlds, all carrying similar scars. They needed access to Vrask's cell, which meant they needed a guard. Guard Thompson had a gambling problem. His debts made him flexible. For the price of 5,000 credits in his prison account, Thompson agreed to arrange a maintenance malfunction that would require emergency cell access. The weapon was a sharpened piece of pipe, stolen from a repair crew and hidden in the ventilation system. Simple, brutal, effective. They would have 3 minutes before other guards responded. 3 minutes to make the Dragon of Nebralis pay for what he had done. But there was a complication. The night janitor, David Walsh. The man had been talking to Vrask for months, leaving him food, treating him like he was something other than a monster. Kellen had watched this with growing disgust. How could anyone show kindness to that thing? How could anyone forget what it had done? Kellen had asked around about David, found out about his dead wife killed on Nebralis 6. That just made it worse. The man had every reason to hate Vrask, and instead he was bringing him extra food. It made no sense. It was a betrayal of everyone who had died. The night of the plan, Kellen waited in the shadows with the others. Thompson had triggered the malfunction. Alarms blared. The cell door to Vrask's cage unlocked for emergency access. They moved fast, covering the distance in seconds. The dragon was waiting for them, standing in the center of his cell, his eyes reflecting the dim emergency lights. "Come then," Vrask said quietly. "Finish it," they attacked. Vrask fought back with devastating precision despite his weakened state. He had been a general for a reason. He moved like violence made flesh, turning their numbers against them. Kellen's friend Stephen went down first, his neck broken with a single strike. Another attacker, Davis, crumpled when Vrask drove an elbow into his solar plexus, but Kellen had the pipe. He swung it at Vrask's head. The alien blocked with his forearm, and Kellen heard something crack. Vrask staggered. Kellen raised the pipe again, ready to end this, ready to give his mother's death meaning. The alarm changed tone. Real guards were coming. But between Kellen and the door stood David Walsh, drawn by the commotion, his face pale in the emergency lighting. The janitor was unarmed, untrained, just a man with a mop who had wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. Kellen made a decision in a fraction of a second. The janitor had chosen his side. David had shown mercy to a monster. That made him complicit. That made him an acceptable target. Kellen charged, the pipe raised, all his rage and loss focused on this one traitor who dared to show kindness to evil. He did not see Vrask move. The dragon, wounded and chained, threw himself forward with the last of his strength. 8 feet of alien mass crashed into Kellen from the side, driving him into the wall. The pipe clattered away across the floor. Kellen's vision swam. He looked up to see Vrask standing between him and David, blood running from a deep gash in the alien's shoulder where the pipe had struck. "No," Vrask said, his voice strained with pain. "Not him." Guards flooded the cell. They dragged Kellen and the others away. Medics rushed to Vrask, whose legs gave out as the adrenaline faded. David stood frozen against the wall, his face white with shock, staring at the blood on the floor. The aftermath was chaos. Commander Hendricks launched a full investigation. Thompson was arrested. Kellen and his co-conspirators were transferred to solitary confinement. Stephen's body was removed. The cell was cleaned, the blood scrubbed away, the evidence collected and cataloged. David was questioned for 6 hours. They asked him about his relationship with Vrask, about whether he had known about the plot, about why he had been in that corridor at that exact moment. David answered each question with mechanical precision. He had been doing his job. He had heard the alarm. He had investigated. No, he had not known about the plot. No, he had not conspired with the inmates. No, he had not asked Vrask to save him. They released him eventually, but the damage was done. Word spread through the station like fire. The janitor had been saved by the dragon. Vrask had chosen to protect a human over defending himself. People drew their own conclusions. David was a collaborator. David was a sympathizer. David had betrayed the memory of everyone who died on Nebralis. Someone left a note in his locker. "Your wife would be ashamed." David crumpled the note in his fist, but could not throw it away. Was it true? Would Margaret be ashamed? She had believed in redemption, in the possibility of change, but would she extend that belief to the alien who had ordered her death? He did not know. He would never know. The dead kept their wisdom to themselves. 3 days later, they allowed David to return to his regular rounds. He approached Vrask's cell with reluctance, unsure of what to say. The alien was recovering from his injuries, his shoulder wrapped in bandages, his movements careful and pained. "You should not have done that," David said finally. Vrask looked up at him through the window. "You warned me. You risked yourself to give me that warning. When the time came, I simply returned the favor. I'm not worth what they'll do to you for this. They can do nothing worse to me than what I have already earned." Vrask moved closer to the window. "Besides, you are wrong. You are worth more than you believe. Your wife knew that. It is why she carried your face with such weight." David closed his eyes. "Don't talk about her." "Very well." Vrask stepped back. "But know this, David Walsh, you owe me nothing. I did not save you to create a debt. I saved you because it was the only honorable action available to me in that moment. Perhaps the only honorable action of my entire life. David left the ration pack as always, but his hands were shaking. Nothing made sense anymore. The monster was supposed to be monstrous. The dragon was supposed to breathe fire and destroy. Instead, Vrask had taken a weapon meant for David, had bled to keep him alive. The universe had become incomprehensible, and David's carefully maintained routine was crumbling at the edges. He finished his shift and went home to his empty apartment, where Margaret's ghost waited to remind him that the world had never been as simple as he wanted it to be. The isolation was complete within a week. Other maintenance workers refused to trade shifts with David. In the cafeteria, entire tables would empty when he approached. Someone sabotaged his cleaning equipment, mixing chemicals that created toxic fumes, sending him to the medical bay with burned lungs. Another time, he found his locker forced open, his personal belongings scattered and broken. Commander Hendricks transferred him to permanent night shift, officially for security purposes, but David understood the real reason. Keep him away from the day workers. Keep him out of sight. Let him do his job in the darkness where no one had to acknowledge his existence. David accepted it all without complaint. What else could he do? Quit and go where? This job was all he had left after Margaret died. The apartment was just a place to sleep. He had no family, no close friends. His entire life had condensed down to work and empty hours. If the work became harder, lonelier, more dangerous, well, that changed nothing fundamental. But the isolation gave him time. Time he spent talking to Vrask during the long night shifts. Time that stretched and filled with conversations that David would never have imagined having. Tell me about the Krathian Dominion, David said one night, more to fill the silence than from genuine curiosity. Vrask, visible through the small window, tilted his head. Why do you wish to know? Because I'm trying to understand how someone becomes you. There was a long pause. Then Vrask began to speak, his voice taking on a distant quality as if he were looking back through decades. The Krathian people were nearly extinct once. 500 years ago, we numbered barely 10 million, confined to one planet surrounded by hostile species. We survived through doctrine. We created a philosophy of strength. The weak become strong through conquest or they are erased. There is no middle ground, no room for mercy. Mercy is how species die. David continued mopping, but he was listening. I was born into the military caste, Vrask continued. Selected at age 4 for officer training. They taught us that empathy was a flaw to be eliminated. They showed us the ruins of our old cities, the bones of our ancestors who had been too weak to survive. They said, this is what happens when you show mercy to your enemies. This is what happens when you hesitate. So you never questioned it. I did not. I excelled. I believed that I was saving my people by subjugating others. I believed that the Nebralis worlds were a threat that needed to be neutralized. The intelligence report said they were building weapons. The strategic analysis said they would attack our supply lines. I did what I was trained to do. I removed the threat with maximum efficiency and minimum Krathian casualties. David stopped mopping. Were they building weapons? Silence, were they? David repeated. No, Vrask said finally. The intelligence was fabricated by hardliners in the Dominion who wanted to expand our territory. I learned this after the campaign ended, when it no longer mattered. By then I had killed billions based on lies. But even knowing it was lies, I am not certain I would have acted differently. The doctrine was absolute. Trust the system. Trust your orders. Trust that strength is survival. That's not strength, David said quietly. That's fear wearing armor. Perhaps. Vrask moved to sit on his bench. But fear is an excellent motivator. I feared that hesitation would make me weak. I feared that questioning orders would mark me as unreliable. Most of all, I feared the silence. What silence? The silence that comes after the guns stop, when there are no more enemies to fight, no more threats to eliminate, when you must face what you have become in the name of survival. Vrask's voice grew softer. I saw a child's drawing once, in the rubble of a city I had ordered destroyed. A family portrait, mother, father, 2 children all holding hands. The child had used bright colors, happy colors. I stared at that drawing for 10 minutes while my subordinates waited for orders. Then I gave the order to continue the bombardment of the next city, because if I stopped, if I acknowledged that the drawing meant something, then I would have to face what I had done, and I was too much of a coward for that. David felt something cold settle in his chest. Why are you telling me this? Because you asked. Because you are the only being in this universe who has treated me as something other than a monster, while knowing exactly what I am. Because Margaret carried your face with weight and I took that from you without ever seeing your face in return. You asked how someone becomes me. Now you know. Cowardice, fear, and a doctrine that turns fear into virtue. David left the ration pack and walked away without another word. He finished his shift in mechanical silence, his mind churning. At home he sat in the darkness of his apartment and thought about Margaret. She had believed that understanding led to change. She had spent her career trying to understand alien species, convinced that knowledge could build bridges. Would she have tried to understand Vrask? Probably. Would she have forgiven him? That was a harder question. 2 weeks later, Commander Hendricks summoned David to her office. She was not alone. 2 officials from the Galactic Coalition were present, 1 human, 1 from a species David did not recognize. They introduced themselves as tribunal coordinators. We're conducting final interviews for General Vrask's formal sentencing, the human official explained. You were involved in the assassination attempt. You've had extended contact with the prisoner. We need your testimony. David's mouth went dry. Testimony about what? About Vrask's behavior in custody. About whether he has shown remorse, rehabilitation potential, whether he represents a continued threat. The alien official leaned forward. Your testimony will be considered when we determine his final sentence. Life imprisonment or execution. They scheduled him for the following week. David went through his shifts in a daze. He had never asked for this responsibility. He did not want the power to decide whether Vrask lived or died. He was just a janitor. Just a man trying to maintain his routine and keep the ghosts at bay. But the universe did not care what he wanted. It never had. One night he asked Vrask directly, "What do you want me to say to them?" "The truth," Vrask answered. "The truth is complicated. Truth often is." David pressed his forehead against the cool metal of the corridor wall. "I don't know if you deserve to live." "Neither do I," Vrask said. "But that is not your burden to carry. You did not kill 2 billion beings, I did. Whatever comes next is mine to face, not yours." "Then why did you save me?" "Because you saw me as something more than my worst actions. Because you showed me that honor still exists, even in small gestures. Because Margaret taught you something valuable, and I did not want that lesson to die with you." Vrask paused. "Because in that moment saving you was the right thing to do. And I have done so many wrong things that I recognized righteousness when I finally encountered it." David walked away without responding. The tribunal was in 3 days. He still did not know what he would say. He only knew that Margaret would have expected him to tell the truth, whatever that meant, and that the truth was more complicated than anyone wanted it to be. The tribunal convened in a converted cargo bay, transformed into a makeshift courtroom. Security was absolute. Snipers positioned in the rafters. Energy barriers surrounded the central area where Vrask would stand. Representatives from 14 species filled the observation galleries, each one representing worlds that had suffered under the Nebralis campaign. David sat in the witness section, his hands folded in his lap, trying not to look at the faces around him. These were survivors, people who had lost everything. Their eyes held the same hollowness he saw in his own mirror every morning. The proceedings began with testimony from victims. A woman from Nebralis in his second described watching her children burn when incendiary weapons hit their school. A man from Nebralis the 8th recounted 3 weeks trapped in a collapsed bunker, drinking contaminated water and eating the dead to survive. A teenager from Nebralis V, barely 16, explained in a flat voice how she had been the only survivor of her entire settlement. 3,000 people reduced to her alone. Vrask stood through it all in his restraints, his expression unreadable. He did not look away. He did not interrupt. He simply listened as person after person described the specific ways in which his orders had destroyed their lives. The prosecution was devastating. They presented military communications showing Vrask had received surrender offers and rejected them. They showed targeting data proving he had deliberately hit civilian areas. They brought in military analysts who confirmed that the level of destruction was far beyond what was strategically necessary. One expert testified that Vrask's tactics suggested a desire not to defeat the enemy, but to erase them entirely. General Vrask did not wage war, the lead prosecutor argued. He waged extermination. He represents a threat not only to those he has already harmed, but to any species that might in the future find themselves in conflict with the Creathian Dominion. Execute him, and send a message that such atrocities will not be tolerated. Let him live, and you tell the universe that genocide has acceptable circumstances. Vrask's defender, a human attorney named Patricia Okoye, had little to work with. She tried to argue that Vrask was a product of his culture's indoctrination, that he had been trained from childhood to view mercy as weakness. She pointed out that he had surrendered peacefully when capture became inevitable, rather than fighting to the death or taking hostages. She noted his behavior in prison had been compliant, but when she asked Vrask if he wanted to present any defense, he simply said, "I did these things. I accept responsibility. Do as you will." The tribunal recessed for 2 days to review evidence. When they reconvened, it was time for final testimonies. David was called to the stand. He walked to the witness chair, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him. The tribunal consisted of 5 judges, representing 5 different species. The lead judge, an elderly human man named Justice Howard Finch, looked at David with something like sympathy. "Mr. Walsh, you have had more direct contact with the defendant than perhaps anyone else during his incarceration. Can you describe his behavior?" David cleared his throat. "He has been quiet, compliant. He does not cause trouble. Has he expressed remorse?" David thought carefully about his answer. "He has expressed understanding of what he did. He has acknowledged the weight of it. Whether that's remorse or just recognition, I cannot say." The lead prosecutor stood. "Mr. Walsh, is it true that the defendant saved your life during an assassination attempt?"
"Yes. Why do you think he did that?"
"You would have to ask him. I am asking you. What reason could a mass murderer have for protecting a prison janitor?" David met the prosecutor's eyes. "I don't know. Maybe the same reason I kept bringing him food. Maybe he was tired of death." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor pressed forward. "You brought him extra food. You spoke with him regularly, despite knowing he was responsible for billions of deaths, including your own wife." "Why?" The courtroom went absolutely silent. David felt every eye focus on him with renewed intensity. He had not mentioned Margaret in any of his previous statements. Now it was out there, exposed, impossible to ignore. "Because someone had to," David said quietly. "Because I could spend the rest of my life hating him, and it would not bring Margaret back. Because she believed that everyone deserved to be seen as more than their worst moment, and I was tired of proving her wrong." "Do you believe General Vrask deserves to live?" David looked across the courtroom to where Vrask stood in his restraints, watching him. The alien's expression was unreadable, but his eyes held something that might have been curiosity or resignation or simply exhaustion. "I believe," David said slowly, "that Margaret would have said everyone deserves a chance to be more than their worst moment. I hated that about her idealism, but she was right more often than I wanted to admit. I do not know if the dragon of Nebralis deserves to live. I only know that becoming the kind of person who could watch him die without question would mean Margaret died for nothing." The prosecutor opened his mouth to ask another question, but Justice Finch held up a hand. "The witness has answered. Mr. Walsh, you may step down." David returned to his seat, his legs unsteady. The tribunal called one more witness. To everyone's surprise, they called Vrask himself. The guards brought him to a reinforced witness stand. The energy barriers hummed at higher intensity. Vrask stood calmly waiting. "General Vrask," Justice Finch said, "you have been offered the opportunity to speak on your own behalf. Do you have anything to say?" Vrask was silent for a long moment. Then he turned to face the gallery where the survivors sat. He looked at each face, taking his time, ensuring he saw them all. "I cannot undo what I have done," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "I cannot restore your dead. I cannot rebuild your worlds. If my death brings you peace, I accept it. I have earned whatever fate you decree." He paused, then continued. "But if I live, I offer this. Let me spend my remaining years helping rebuild what I destroyed. Let me carry stones with these hands that once commanded fire. Let me clear rubble, repair infrastructure, restore what can be restored. It will not be enough. Nothing will be. But it will be something. Let me spend every day facing the consequences of my actions. Let me see the faces I never saw when they were numbers in reports. Let survivors spit on me as I work. Let them curse me. Let them hate me. I will accept it all. Because that is justice. Not my death in a clean execution, but my life spent in service to those I harmed. The gallery erupted. Some shouted approval, others screamed for his execution. The judges called for order, and security guards moved to restore calm. Vrask stood silently through the chaos, his eyes still fixed on the survivors, his expression one of absolute resignation. The tribunal recessed for final deliberations. They returned 6 hours later. Justice Finch read the verdict in a voice that trembled slightly with emotion. General Vrask of the Krathian Dominion, you have been found guilty of all charges. War crimes, crimes against sentient beings, genocide. The tribunal has considered all testimony and evidence. We sentence you to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. You will be assigned to reconstruction labor on the Nebralis worlds. You will work until you die or become physically unable to continue. This is the judgment of this tribunal. The courtroom erupted again, but David barely heard it. He sat in his chair, feeling nothing in particular, wondering if Margaret would have approved, wondering if justice had been served or merely delayed, wondering what came next in a universe that had become incomprehensible. 6 months after the tribunal, David stood in the transport station on Earth, holding a single bag containing everything he owned. The offer from Core Station 17 had been generous. Better pay, better conditions, a chance to start over somewhere no one knew him as the man who had shown kindness to the Dragon of Nebralis. He had been on the verge of accepting when he saw the other posting. Nebralis 4 needed maintenance workers for the reconstruction effort. The pay was terrible. The conditions were harsh. Living quarters would be basic. But there was a line in the job description that stuck in his mind. Applicants must be comfortable working in close proximity to prisoners assigned to labor details. David had stared at that line for an hour before making his decision. Margaret's voice in his head as always, asking him questions he did not want to answer. What would it mean to walk away now? What would it mean to finish what he had started? He submitted his application to Nebralis 4. Under the section asking for reasons for requesting this assignment, he wrote simply, "Unfinished business." They accepted him within a week. Nebralis 4 was a broken world trying to heal. The bombardment had left vast sections of the planet uninhabitable. The reconstruction focused on the areas that could be salvaged, slowly building new cities on the bones of the old ones. The work crews were mixed, civilian workers alongside prisoners, all under the watchful eyes of armed guards. Vrask arrived with a transport of other convicted war criminals, though none of their crimes approached his scale. They assigned him to heavy construction. His size and strength made him ideal for moving debris, lifting beams, clearing the largest sections of rubble. They fitted him with monitoring devices that would alert guards if he strayed from designated areas. They gave him a number, 4782, though everyone just called him Dragon. David reported for his first shift 2 days after Vrask's arrival. He was assigned to the maintenance bay that serviced the construction equipment. It was hard work in difficult conditions, but David had never minded hard work. It kept the routine intact, kept the ghosts at bay. He saw Vrask from a distance on the 3rd day. The alien was working with a crew clearing a collapsed building, his massive form visible even from across the construction site. David watched for a moment, then returned to his own work. They were both here now. That was enough for the moment. 3 weeks passed before they spoke. David was checking the hydraulic system on a loader when Vrask approached, carrying a damaged pneumatic hammer. The alien stopped 10 feet away, clearly visible to the guards, and waited for acknowledgement. David looked up from his work. Problem with the hammer? The pressure valve is malfunctioning. Set it down over there. I will log it for repair. Vrask placed the tool on the designated rack, then hesitated. You should not have come. David continued his inspection of the loader. Funny. I was about to say the same thing to you. I did not choose to be here. Neither did I, really. David straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. But here we are anyway. Might as well make the best of it. The best of it, Vrask repeated, something like dark amusement in his voice. I carry stones where I once commanded firestorms. I rebuild what I destroyed, and the best of it is that everyone here would prefer I die. Then do not die. That seems to annoy them more. For the first time since arriving on Nebralis, something like genuine emotion crossed Vrask's face. It might have been surprise or respect or simply confusion. Then he turned and walked back to his work crew, and David returned to his maintenance tasks. A pattern emerged over the following weeks. Brief exchanges when Vrask needed equipment serviced. Professional distance maintained, both for David's safety and for the appearance of propriety. The survivors who lived and worked on Nebralis 4 watched every interaction with suspicion, but there was nothing to report. A prisoner needed a tool fixed. A maintenance worker fixed it. Nothing more, but the work itself became something neither of them had expected. Vrask labored 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, moving debris that would have required machinery for human workers. His body bore new scars from the work, scrapes and cuts and burns from handling unstable materials. The guards never showed mercy, never lightened his load, never acknowledged that he was working harder than regulations required. David noticed this, but said nothing. What could he say? The work was Vrask's penance, self-imposed, accepted without complaint. The survivors noticed, too. An elderly woman named Ruth, who had lost her entire family on Nebralis 4 during the bombardment, made it her daily ritual to spit at Vrask as he worked. Every day for 3 months she would stand near his work site and spit. Vrask never acknowledged her. He simply continued his labor. Then one day, Ruth did not spit. She stood in her usual place, watched Vrask lift a massive beam into position and walked away in silence. David, who had witnessed this routine from a distance, felt something shift in the universe. Small changes accumulated. The reconstruction progressed. A hospital rose where one had burned. A school opened on ground that had been scorched black. Children played in a park that Vrask's crew had cleared of debris and radiation. No one thanked him. No one acknowledged his contribution. But the work existed, solid and real. 2 years into his sentence, an accident occurred. A building that was being demolished collapsed prematurely, trapping 3 workers under tons of concrete and steel. The emergency crews could not reach them without risking further collapse. Vrask was working nearby when the accident happened. He could have followed protocol, waited for the structural engineers, let the proper procedures unfold. Instead, he moved. He entered the unstable structure without hesitation, his size allowing him to navigate spaces that would have been impassable for others. He found the trapped workers, one of them Isaac, a survivor who had made his hatred of Vrask abundantly clear for 2 years. Isaac had a crushed leg and was fading in and out of consciousness. Vrask stabilized the immediate debris around Isaac, then physically carried him out of the collapse zone. He went back for the other 2 workers, making 3 trips through a structure that was actively failing until all 3 were safe. On the final trip, a support beam gave way and crushed Vrask's left arm. He dragged himself out anyway, refusing assistance until the workers were secured. The medical team treated Vrask last. His arm was badly broken in multiple places. He would be out of heavy labor for months. As the medics worked on him, Isaac, now stabilized and conscious, stared at the alien who had saved his life. "You could have let us die," Isaac said quietly. "Everyone would have called it an accident." Vrask, his face tight with pain, said simply, "But it would not have been an accident. It would have been another choice." "I have made enough of those." David heard about the incident from other workers. He visited Vrask in the medical bay that evening, after his shift ended. The alien was alone, his arm in a complex brace, staring at the ceiling. "Heard you were playing hero," David said from the doorway. "I was doing my job." "Your job does not include risking your life for people who hate you." Vrask turned his head to look at David. "My job is to rebuild. Sometimes that means stones. Sometimes that means carrying people out of collapsing buildings. It is still reconstruction." David pulled up a chair and sat. They remained in silence for a long time. 2 beings who had found themselves in an incomprehensible situation, trying to make sense of a universe that offered no easy answers. "Margaret would have liked you," David said finally. "Not forgiven you, but liked you. She had this way of seeing potential in things that seemed broken beyond repair. Was she correct about the potential? I do not know yet. Ask me in another 20 years. I may not have 20 years. Then I guess we will find out together." 5 years into Vrask's sentence, a memorial wall was completed in the center of New Settlement 7, the largest of the rebuilt cities on Nebralis 4. The wall was black granite, polished to a mirror surface inscribed with the names of everyone who had died in the bombardment. 2,400,018 names. Vrask visited the wall every week on his rest day. He would stand before it for hours reading names silently. David sometimes saw him there during his own off time, They never spoke during these visits. The wall demanded silence. One afternoon, David approached the wall to find Vrask and Ruth standing together. They were not speaking, just standing side by side, looking at names. Ruth's family was there somewhere in that vast list. She placed her hand on the wall, found a section, and stood still. Vrask stood 3 feet away, his head bowed. After several minutes, Ruth spoke without looking at him. "I still hate you. I know. But you built the school where my granddaughter learns. You cleared the ground where my son's grave stands. You did not have to do those things. I did," Vrask said quietly. "I destroyed them first." "Yes, you did." Ruth finally turned to look at him. "I will hate you until I die. But I will also remember that you tried to make it right even though you never could." She walked away, leaving Vrask alone before the wall of names. David stepped closer. "Think you will ever finish reading them all?" "No, there are too many. But I will try. That's all any of us can do." Above them, the sky of Nebralis was beginning to clear. Atmosphere processors were slowly removing the radiation and ash from the bombardment. In another decade, the sky might be blue again. People might look up and see stars instead of a gray dome of death. The work continued. David maintained equipment. Vrask carried stones. The survivors watched and judged and slowly, incrementally began to heal. Not because they forgave. Not because they forgot. But because the universe demanded that life continue. And continuing required moving forward, even when the weight of the past made every step feel impossible. Years later, news services would report on Vrask's work with mixed reactions. Some called it insufficient punishment for his crimes. Others called it meaningless theater. But on Nebralis 4, the people who lived in the buildings he helped reconstruct, who sent their children to schools on land he cleared, who visited graves in cemeteries he made accessible, they understood something more complex. Justice and redemption were not the same thing. Vrask would never be redeemed. His crimes were too vast, too deliberate, too complete. But justice could take many forms. And perhaps there was a kind of justice in watching a dragon spend his remaining years building, rather than destroying, in seeing a weapon turned into a tool, in knowing that even monsters could choose differently when the moment of choice arrived. David and Vrask continued their work, side by side but separate, two beings marked by the same tragedy from opposite sides, trying to find meaning in a universe that offered none easily. The routine sustained them both. The routine and the knowledge that somewhere, in the spaces between hatred and forgiveness, between punishment and redemption, there existed a path forward. It was not an easy path. It was not a fair path. But it was a path, and they walked it together, one day at a time until the end of their respective journeys.